you everyone for coming out tonight, and welcome to the Iowa caucuses. Who's winning, by the way? We'll see. I'm a Warren delegate, so what do I know? So we'll see, and I'm sure Bernie's going to do quite well in Iowa. So, well, thank you for coming out. Thanks to our host tonight. When Ariel was speaking, it reminded me that last year I had the pleasure to speak to this organization, and I made a comment that they have the hardest acronym of any organization I've ever spoken to, GVSHP, and then 2 days later they sent out an email changing the name to Village Preservation. So I'm not going to make any jokes about names tonight so they don't change it. But thank you everyone for coming out, and I'll make sure we get you out of here before the State of the Union, because I'm sure you're all very eager for... Someone applauded for that. But let's talk about cities tonight, the future of cities, where they're going, and what that's going to look like. I think before you go forward anywhere, it's important to look back, because in the beginning, I like to think of early cities as the internet, before the internet. You needed them for everything, to communicate, for community, for commerce, and you actually, at that point in time, did need walls. But over time, cities have changed. You know, throughout human history, we've lived in rural communities. The world was dominated not by cities, but by those living outside of cities. By the year 1700, that started to change. And here we are in 1954. You can see how small portions of the world, of course us here in the United States, but most of the world, most people lived outside of cities. And just in case Mike Pompeo is here, there's Ukraine. Just want to point that out. I couldn't tell if he was going to be joining us tonight. But let's go forward here. Let's go forward, because here we are today. And now for the first time in 10,000 years of history, the majority of us on this planet live in cities. And that pace has accelerated over the last 50 years to a dramatic effect. And part of the result of that is this map, which brings us to a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight. On the one hand, cities have never been more important because they house the majority of our humanity. Now, at the same time, they've never been more dangerous because they're contributing to our own peril. And so this dilemma is what we're going to talk about, but within the dilemma is also the opportunity. So where did cities go wrong, and where can cities go right in the future? To do that, let's start our story here. In 1939, at the World's Fair, so over 44 million people came to see the World's Fair. This was the most popular exhibit. It was sponsored by the automotive industry. It was called Futurama. And this was Disney World before Disney World. Folks got into these little seats, and they spun around and saw the city of the future. What was the city of the future in 1939? It was 8-lane highways, symmetrical shaped buildings, wide boulevards. It was free of traffic. It was free of congestion. It was also free of people. Look closely. The planners hadn't bothered to account for how people would live in the city of the future. Their focus instead was how people would pass through the city of the future. Now this is a sign of things to come. And at the end of World War II, we ended up weaponizing our very roads as a way to fight the Cold War, because we had an ace to fight the Soviets in the Cold War. And what was our secret weapon? The car. The car equaled democracy. I don't have to rely on the train schedule anymore. I can get in my car. I can go where I want to go. No one can tell me when I have to go, where I have to go. The car was freedom and democracy in itself. And the rule of the car was absolute. Post-World War II, we lived in an autocracy, where the car was the supreme way that we were going to travel above all else. So we're free from the tyranny of the train schedule. Americans can go anywhere they want to go, and go they did. When traffic jams mounted, what did we do? Build more roads. More roads, more traffic. More traffic, more roads, more cars, as we're underwriting the entire automotive industry, and you can see where this is going. And we built them everywhere. And the blank canvases of Long Island, right through the middle of our own city. It didn't matter whether it was a dense part of town or an empty town. By the time anyone stopped to ask if this was wise or if it was too late to change course, it was already too late. The car itself had become this own breathing and moving form of democracy, not of democracy, but of autocracy. And it's the kind of autocracy that we've never seen before. Cloaked with this traffic, no one seemed to notice that our experiment with autocracy had failed. But no one else seemed to notice something else, and this is an important point. No one noticed that our experiment with democracy failed. Because earlier I said they built roads here, they built highways here, but in truth, there was no they. There was only he. This is usually where there's a technical glitch, because from above or below or wherever he is, I get the power cuts out here or something. But the autocrat who ruled over the autocracy was, of course, Robert Moses. When we think about corruption, and there's plenty of that today, but when we think of corruption, the currency of corruption is money. We don't think about corruption having the currency of power. But that's the corruption that Robert Moses had in his 44-year reign over the city. And Moses comes to power at just the right time, where he can run the autocracy that's growing around the country. And in my last lecture, I talked about the rise of Robert Moses, and I know some of you were here for that. If you have questions about that later, I'll be happy to address them. We could do a whole other session just on Moses. But when we think about Moses, and everyone thinks about what he built. Here are 52 of the many examples, but just roads and bridges and highways that you know of. 52 projects, 400 miles of roads, almost 700 playgrounds, $150 billion in today's money spent. And what do we get for that? At the peak of his power, let's do this like a movie screen, right? So at the peak of his power, he holds 12 appointed positions, right? Sometimes you'll Google Robert Moses, and you'll see Governor Robert Moses, Senator Robert Moses, Mayor Robert Moses. He was none of those things. Robert Moses was appointed. At the peak of his power, as Parks Commissioner and Construction Coordinator, he proposes projects, and then as the leading member of the City Planning Commission, he approved what he proposed. And yes, this happened, and yes, this was perfectly legal at the time. 5 mayors, 6 governors, 7 presidents. There are many ways that you can measure the longevity of Robert Moses. When we look at Moses, we mostly look at New York City in terms of what he did to the city here and after World War II. And most people think that this is the photo that best symbolizes New York after World War II. You know, New York is not a capital, right? Like, when you think about a great city in the world, you think London, Paris, Tokyo, these are capital cities, right? But New York isn't even the capital of our state, let alone the capital of the country. So instead, after World War II, New York becomes something else entirely. It becomes the capital of the world. But in my mind, the photo that defines New York in the post-World War II era is not the gleaming building along the waterfront. It's the highway coming through the community. You can see the encroachment here. Literally, the road being rammed directly through this community here. This is up in the Bronx. And I think that best encapsulates our decision-making and what happens as a result. This becomes the city of New York. This is the city of New York. This is Charlotte Street up in the Bronx. A street that was so blighted that by the middle of the 1970s, it was removed from city maps. This is President Carter visiting the street. We're going to return to this later. But it was also the city of fear, where they were telling you not to go on the streets after 6 p.m., and so on. And these were pamphlets that were passed around. But more than what the city became, as a result of poor planning, we also need to discuss what the city lost. It's hard to explain to people what the loss of Penn Station meant to the city. There may be some people who remember the station, which was destroyed in 1964. But it's, when you go through it today and you compare the two, of course, it's so different. One of the things that are still there, you know, the steps are the same steps, believe it or not. So next time you're on track 17 and 18, I'll show you the next slide. They're still there. That's all, you can actually recognize them if you look closely enough. But that's all that's there. Writing in the New York Times, Ada Louise Huxtable said, "We'll probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but by those we destroyed." And I think with Penn Station and the destruction of Penn Station, there are lessons. But this is why this is important. Because today we have elected leadership who say things that make me think we want to return to the era of Moses, that we want to return to the autocrats. Just this month, Governor Cuomo cited not one, not two, but 3 people in his administration as the next Robert Moseses. Can you imagine such a thing? When Eliot Spitzer was governor, he said, "At least he got things done." Speaking of Robert Moses, at least he got things done. But the problem that we have is we're so enamored with the might of construction that too often we forget about the right of construction. And that is the challenge before us. When Robert Moses came to New York, there were 7.4 million people in the city. 40 years later, there were 7 million. Why is this important? It's important because if you go through 400 years of census data, which we have, you can see that there's not one 40-year period in 400 years of history where the population of New York declined. Wars, famine, smallpox, Republicans, whatever it was, New York's population continued to rise until Robert Moses came along. It was for that reason that recently I called for Robert Moses' name to be removed from all state parks and state roads. And the legislature has, well, excuse me, I jumped slightly. The legislature has picked this up and maybe rename them after Jane Jacobs, which I think would be a good way to go. So you can, I'm working with the state legislature right now on this bill, so we'll see where it goes. But that gets me to, of course, Jane Jacobs, who I know we all know in this room. But what I want to remind people, because it's often forgotten, and I think it's especially true today when we talk about gender norms, that when Jane Jacobs would go and speak, when Jane Jacobs would go out and she would write, people would refer to her as Jane Jacobs, and there's always a comma after her name. What was the comma? Jane Jacobs, a housewife. That's right. Jane Jacobs is a very accomplished woman, a very accomplished writer, before she wrote Death and Life of Great American Cities. And so this sort of misogyny that overlapped her career is something that she had to struggle with. And she was not just a pioneer for urban planning, she's a pioneer for women because she did things in that time that were unheard of and unprecedented. And I think only today we're beginning to realize that. The streets that Jane Jacobs wrote about, the ballet of the streets, the self-policing safety networks that they create, the neighborhood, the fabric of a neighborhood, the very things that Robert Moses was tearing apart during the middle of the century, Jane Jacobs was trying to stitch back together in her writing. Some of the most egregious examples of things she fought, which today seems so silly, it's hard to imagine these are true, but the next 2 slides would show you on a Google map of today, first, what the lower Manhattan Expressway would look like. No Soho, no Little Italy, more or less, but we have this 8-lane highway running right through where Soho is. It seems so silly, so foreign today, but people forget that this was a fait accompli during the 1960s and early 70s too. The Mid-Manhattan Expressway, perhaps just as egregious. Can you imagine at one point the proposal was for this expressway to run through the Empire State Building? Imagine the security risk that would pose today. But this is where we were planning in the 20th century, for people to go from New Jersey to Long Island and to cut through Manhattan to do so. And without people like Jane Jacobs, this is actually what would have happened. Robert Moses called his roads, he had a term for them. He called them the Arterial Highway Program, and I think that perfectly sums up what roads really do. They're arteries. What's an artery? It takes lifeblood away from the heart. The best urban planning projects aren't arteries, they're veins. They're projects that draw in life to the heart of the city. And I want to give you a very quick example of one such project. Let's go back to 1820. This is not when Facebook was founded, but blue, white, and black. 123,000 people lived in New York City. This is DeWitt Clinton. Did anyone know that? That would have been really impressive if anyone got it. Usually I offer like a prize or something. So DeWitt Clinton proposes the Erie Canal. It's a very controversial project which would link New York through this canal here with the Great Lakes, and then with the river system in the Midwest, and connect New York around the country. It was so unpopular that DeWitt Clinton was voted out of office before the canal could open. He then won for re-election. The canal cost $7.1 million. Before the canal opened up, it paid for itself. Before it officially opened. That's how successful it was. Why was it successful? Well, goods that once cost $125 and took 45 days to ship, now shipped in 9 days and cost $6. So you can see the cost of commerce and capital drop dramatically through a public sector investment, and the economy explodes here in New York. At the time, our population was similar to Boston, to Philadelphia, and then, by 1860, we're 10 times bigger. Well on our way. We're no longer competing with Boston and Philadelphia. All of a sudden, we're competing with Paris and London. All of a sudden, we become this world leader. It's because of smart planning. It wasn't anything magical. We have a great deep water harbor here, but we weren't connected to the Midwest. But the Erie Canal did that. Back to Moses, which is the opposite. The question is, what can a city survive, and what leads to its fall? We know that cities will survive foreign armies. Jay Jacobs taught us that cities can survive drug epidemics. We know to date, that cities can survive storms. But the car. Jane Jacobs warned us that it's the car that's the danger to the city, the sacker of cities. It's a unique actor in her ballet because it removes, it isolates, it spreads people out, it turns Jane Jacobs' ballet into a circus. And in our case, in New York City, in many cases, that circus became a freak show. Subway ridership, you can see on the end there, is now down over the last few years. We're actually moving away from increased ridership on our subways and our buses. And we're trying to push people to transportation alternatives, which is really just a moniker for everything but the car. And what we need to really do is remove the autocracy from our thinking and think about the car in an even playing field with other forms of transportation. I always found this funny that one of the alternatives to driving in the car, a transportation alternative here, is someone walking with their feet. As if that's foreign to us. It's funny, but it's true. What we want to do is now reimagine the streetscape where all forms of transportation are treated equally, and we're no longer investing our dollars, because every dollar spent in column A can't go into column B. It's the opportunity cost of planning. And of that $150 billion that Moses spent, guess how much went to mass transit? None. Virtually none. The investments were all made on the car, and now we're paying the price for that. You know, over the course of time, there have been three variations of the street. The first variation is the Tradesmen Street, which was the private sector filling in topography for trade and for commerce. And when they needed something from the local government, like in this case, this is Stone Street, which is still exactly how it was back when, with minus electrification and obviously some of the modern features. But then the city would come in and pave the road. But the streets themselves were designed by locals for trade and commerce. There was no real order or cohesion to it. And that changes in 1811 when we get the grid. There's nothing about the grid system that's different. The grids existed in Philadelphia, existed in Washington, but here the grid would be dominant above all other forms of getting around. There would be no intersections that there are, like plazas that there are in Washington, D.C. The grid would dominate all of the city, and they missed Central Park here because that came in the 1850s. But pretty much the grid of 1811 is with us today. It was so big and audacious at the time that you could fit the entire population of the United States into the grid. And also thinking ahead about development for future development, with dividing up the parcels as they did here. By the way, the seminary is still there on 20th Street. It made it easy for private development of the city, because at the time it just took up the southern portion of the island. There's another photo of the grid. I love seeing the grid in action. This is Central Park West. That's the Museum of Natural History right there. 76th and 75th Streets. So you can see how it looks obviously a lot different, but if you look close enough, you can make it out and see how the grid would take form and change neighborhoods. This is a picture of the grid when it barreled through 42nd and 2nd Avenue. This is in 1861. The streets were lowered to be made on grade, and then property owners were responsible for bringing down their property. So over here, the morning I was told that the lines outside the Starbucks were terrible. Just unbelievable. No, I'm just kidding. It wasn't a Starbucks. It was a Duane Reade. So the third iteration came in the streets of Robert Moses, which are really the highways of Robert Moses that cut through our neighborhood and made a city something to pass through as opposed to something to live in. This is sort of the throw-up of the highways, as you can see here, the Cross Bronx Expressway cutting its wide swath. I've been asked by someone, actually I was asked by someone here when I spoke to Village Preservation last year, if I could sum up Robert Moses in a word or in a sentence, and I said, New York needed a Robert Moses, but instead we got the Robert Moses. Meaning we needed to modernize the city, but instead we got someone who was, hell-bent on, and if you look back at it, mostly destroying what was great about it. And the proof is in the pudding because of the population loss and how the city sort of spiraled so quickly. What I want to talk to you about tonight is what I call the living streetscape. It's what's next. This is the part of the conversation where we're going to think big and think about how the future of the city can be different, how it can be less autocratic. We all know that Jane Jacobs was right. I don't think there's much conversation on that today. It's one thing to say, yeah, Jane Jacobs was right, but it's another thing to say that Jane Jacobs has won, that the battles of the past have been settled. Because if Jane Jacobs has won, how is it that we have shadows that are cast on Central Park for 60 people in one building and 180 people in another building? We looked at this kind of a design of a streetscape and we say, well, no one thinks to design or plan for communities that way anymore. It's not done. And then I went to the opening of Hudson Yards. So I noticed some similarities there. I don't know if you see them too. So in this future streetscape, the street must serve those who live in the city and not who pass through it. The street is a catalyst to promote wellness and sustainability, and the street should move the most amount of people in the most efficient way. Here's an example of, I think we have about 200 people with us tonight, so I pulled out this slide. So this is 200 cars. So this is, in New York, this would be about 10 blocks of traffic, maybe 9, depending on how they're spaced out. So if you took that same amount of people, everyone in this room is in a car, and that would be about 10 city blocks. And then if I took everyone in this room, I could fit you in 2 buses, seated. I could probably get everyone on one bus if you've been there in rush hour. Here's the same 200-person example on bicycles. Evenly spaced out, of course. Here's another example which I like, which reminds me that when people are in traffic, they're not sitting in traffic. Cars are the traffic, right? Like the way we design our streetscape, we're creating the traffic. So here's an example of 200 people in cars, in a bus, 75 people in a bus, and then on bicycle. And so when we think about the future of planning, 14th Street is an interesting case study because I think 14th Street is an incomplete right now. Now, while it's great that the traffic is down, that doesn't mean that we're done, right? So 14th Street looked like this, softened, now it looks empty with cars, not cars going through it. But this is not a healthy streetscape either. And that's what we have to acknowledge. That change has to come to our streets, and I think in a really dramatic way. This is a good example of what I find of the problems with our bike lanes today. Vision Zero is a very important goal. We're not close. In fact, if you notice the statistics, we're going the other way. We had how many bicycle fatalities last year? Someone may know the answer. More than 29 or so? I think it was. Too many. The truth is that the car and the bike simply don't exist side by side, and these are reasons why. And so just because it's set up like this now doesn't mean it has to be set up like this in the future. What are some solutions that we can look at? First, the bike lane, go with me on this, does not need to be graded on the street level. I'll give you one good example of this. Central Park West, which moves two ways, both north and south, doesn't need to. It could move just north with a two-way dedicated bike lane that's on the level of the sidewalk. You could do this on 14th Street too. You could do this on 23rd Street. You could do this on 34th Street. On and on, there are blocks in the city where you can regrade and remove the actor of the car from the actor of the bike, forever separating them by grading. It's going to keep everyone safe. But the other thing that you can do is you can ring that with a greenery that grows very well in New York. You know what that is? Someone said marijuana. Not the ginkgo tree, apple trees. So you could grow apple trees in New York. I'm going to show you examples of apple trees that have grown in New York for many years, and you can have people pick fresh fruit right off the trees. We grow figs, we grow ginkgo. There's lots of things you can do to think different about the streetscape. But this idea of the car mixing with the bike and everyone's just going to go in their own lane, it's going to be fine. Folks, it's not working. Okay? It's just not working because you have trucks doing this, and you've all seen what happens when bicycles swerve out, someone's not following instructions, and we're not getting closer to the problem. We're not getting closer to the solution. We're just creating a new problem. And so if we think about regrading our entire streetscape and adding trees to our streetscape, that's going to make a big difference because we're in a fight right now for sustainability. And there are all these amazing plans out there that call for these filters that suck carbon out of the air, and then they turn it into oxygen, and there's this company that's raising $100 million right now, this carbon-sucking machine. All you need is a freaking tree. Okay? It does the same thing. We've lost our way on that. And I think when we talk about now redesigning the entire streetscape, we have to think about sustainability and livability, and we can achieve both. But it takes a radical redesign. This is, I always found this interesting in that if you're traveling on mass transit, some of you may live in Queens or in Brooklyn, usually you have to go through Manhattan to get to one or the other, unless you're on the G train and you happen to be by Greenpoint. But I think it's time, people have talked about building more roads and highways to connect parts of Brooklyn and parts of Queens. I would actually go the other way, and I would build what I would call Jane's Way, which is a bike highway that would connect the two. They're doing it in China, they're doing it in Norway, they don't cost that much, and you can move people safely. If we're going to build any more roads in New York City, let it be for bikes, let it be for pedestrians. We don't need more highways for cars. We've seen where that goes. The other thing we need to do is get sensible about our street parking rules. Some of you who park on the street, you'll know that you have to sit in the car for an hour and a half until the street sweeper comes by. While you're sitting there, if it's cold out, you have the car on, and you're idling, all those carbon emissions are going up into the sky. Doesn't make any sense. The second that street sweeper comes through, you should be able to turn the car off, you should be able to get out of it, but at the very least, you shouldn't be ticketed. We're contributing to huge CO2 emissions. A car is at its most emissionable when it's idle. So we have all these cars every day, thousands of cars just sitting there. Also, I think the streets of New York are for the taxpayers of New York. I love New Jersey, but I think if they want to come in and park here, they should pay, and then you should have residentially zoned parking. You can park in your community board for free, but if you're outside, you should pay, because I don't think our roads can be free anymore, and we want to push people and encourage people over to mass transit. We want to start thinking differently about our buildings. This is a building in Flatbush that's going up that is 100% electric. It won't use any power from the city grid. It's an office building. That's the kind of building we need to think more about. And also we need to be smart about our future when it comes to plastic. In 2050, there'll be more plastic in the sea than fish. And since we eat fish, we're going to be consuming plastic. Very dangerous. It's a growing threat. It's a threat that I saw to cities about 10 years ago. This is an email, I blocked out who I sent this to, but I encouraged someone in March of 2010 to do a ban of plastic bags here in New York, and I'm very proud that 10 years later, it's going into effect in 1 month. It took 10 years. But we need that, and we need more of it. Single-use plastic is a huge environmental hazard. The city can also do more, though, when it comes to plastic. I think it's time to eliminate the sale of plastic water bottles in parks and government offices, and install filling stations. and have non-plastic solutions in water bottles. These are some of the beaches and shores across the world. He's on a boat there, that's in water. This is in Indonesia. This is very, very serious, and getting worse, getting worse. But there are all sorts of solutions out there right now. I don't know if anyone's ever tried. I just tried this last week. It was fascinating. It's a bottle-free bottled water, and it's seaweed. You put it in your mouth, and it pops, and the water comes out. Quite a concept. But there are all sorts of other things, and that's too radical for you. They have bottles made out of plants, which are also good. Of course, we have filling stations. We have a filling station right here in this building on the first floor. I noticed it when I came in. And then, of course, we have this thing here in New York called tap water, which is quite good. And for those who care about bottled water, just so you know, the bottled water in Poland Springs just is tap water from Michigan and Wisconsin. So it's the same thing. But this city, what I find interesting is when we really marshal ourselves and really try to make a difference, urban farms work. In World War II, when we had food shortages, we produced 200 million pounds of vegetables here in the city. They were called victory farms, and they were grown everywhere. And it's amazing. We don't think about the city as we think about it as an urban jungle. We don't realize that it once was a very lush place. And so the soil is still there. It has not changed enough where it would work. And we can do this when we marshal our strengths and our energy. We can transform the city in a host of ways, and that's why we need to think about urban farming in a whole new way, about the way we grow our building and the kind of things that we can produce, like oxygen from development. And we have to push ourselves to think about how this city of the future can be. There was a quote, and I love this. I want to read this to you from a sustainable development company, or advisor really. Agriculture and forestry in the city answer to a variety of urban development goals beyond the provision of green infrastructure and food, such as social inclusion, adaptation to climate change, poverty alleviation, urban water management, and opportunities to produce and reuse urban waste. Speaking of urban waste, I want to go back here. Charlotte Street, 1976. So blighted it was removed from the map of New York City. It wasn't on the map anymore. President Carter came and visited. Charlotte Street today. Not a sign of what was once there. This is the exact spot where Carter stood. Cities have the ability to regenerate and to grow. We just have to think beyond what we see today and imagine what can be possible in the future tomorrow. People say, well, Manhattan's an urban jungle, and what I'm proposing with this fourth iteration of our streetscape is moving the city forward. I disagree. I actually think we're moving the city back to its beginning. This is New York City in Manhattan in 1609. For us to be responsible stewards of the land, to rise up to the challenges of our time, we can do this. We shall not cease from exploration, T.S. Eliot once wrote, and at the end of all our exploring will be to arrive at where we started and to know that place for the first time. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. And, thank you. I'm happy to take any questions, and we can put the house lights up to it in a minute. Yeah?
Yeah, I enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
There is, I think, next year, some kind of a tax below 60th Street.
Yes, congestion pricing.
Can you talk about that?
Sure, so what's going to happen, yeah, so congestion pricing is, I think, part of the solution. Not the whole solution, but it'll help. So cars that enter the city, once they go south of 60th Street, it's as if they're going over a toll booth. The car will be rung up and there'll be a fee charge to that car starting in March of 2021.
Automatic.
Yes. So there'll be different charges for depending how many axles you have. The goal is to push people away from congesting the midtown of Manhattan and to encourage them to take mass transit into the city. Yeah?
I live on 13th, and we're concerned about the fact that 14th Street, if traffic is banned, if cars are banned from 14th Street, all the side streets will be getting that traffic and will be getting that congestion, and we're concerned about the emissions, carbon emissions, and noise pollution.
Yeah. So you should be. So the two things I'd say is, one is the theory of easy accessible roads, which led to more cars, which is proven true. The inverse is also true. You make it more difficult, you reduce the amount of cars. So it's not like every car is going to go on to 13th Street, because in theory, if the theory holds, there'll be less cars in the perimeter. Obviously, you're seeing I'm sure you're seeing an increase in cars.
Not as much as we thought.
But so that's the theory sort of taking hold, right? So, and I think when I met with DOT about this, the concern was that the first year was going to be chaos with all the cars. It hasn't happened. It really should get better over time, because as we make not just 14th Street unfriendly to cars, but the rest of the island, it's going to push people to alternatives. But those alternatives, by the way, have to be good. Because if the bus system's terrible, no one's going to take it. If the subway system's unreliable, no one's going to use it. So, and not everyone is going to ride a bicycle. So the alternatives have to be there. And luckily, the bus times are really, I don't know if you've taken that crosstown bus on 14th Street. I mean, you fly, which is amazing, because that used to be really slow. Any other questions? Yeah?
You haven't talked anything about climate change and the changes that New York is going to have to deal with.
So we have to have, so first of all buildings have to be retrofitted. Obviously, there's the plan now for that. The biggest emissions in the city are from buildings and obviously from cars. That all needs to change immediately. We saw Sandy was not a once in a 100-year storm. It's going to be like once in a decade storm. Then it's going to be a once every year storm if we're not careful. That's why we need to really change every new building that gets built. Has to have a different environmental code, in my opinion. It has. Yeah.
What about the coastlines?
You mean like putting in the wetlands?
Or it's going to be a different island.
Yeah.
There's going to be less of it.
Well, no, there will be, but one of the plans for that is to create the wetlands around the southern barrier, which worked very well in Europe, actually. In Amsterdam, that's worked very well. So I think that's part of it too. But I also think that it's a fundamental shift, which is why I talk about plastic, because the average person uses a plastic bag for 12 minutes before they discard it. Like, if we can get off the plastic treadmill, I think we'll see that other things are possible too. I think it's easier. I think we should be starting with what people touch every day and then expanding from there too. Anyone else? Yeah?
Congestion pricing revenue, where is that money going to?
It goes to Andrew, Cuomo Andrew. I don't think it goes to the...
MTA?
I don't know if it goes to the MTA or if it goes to... Which authority it goes to? I mean, it's supposed to fund mass transit. I don't know if it goes directly to the MTA, though. But the idea is that it's supposed to fund in our investments. Obviously, we need investments in mass transit, you know. I don't think it's going there. I think the plan is for it to go into rails and buses. Yeah.
What about this? What I hear that they're planning to do something. I'm not sure what it would be called. It's like a barrier.
Yeah. So the wetlands.
In front of Manhattan.
Yep. So that's worked very well to protect coastal cities in Europe.
Is that wetlands you're saying?
Well, there's a couple of different ways. You could put a wetland in there. You could you could literally build barriers, like barrier dunes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they're all being looked at. We will need to do something. Yeah.
You mentioned the residential parking, which has been very successful in other cities.
Yeah.
What is the reality of that?
Honestly, it seems so obvious to me. I cannot understand why we do it the way we do. And it's such an easy thing to change. That seems to be to be a no-brainer. I can't believe, I went to college in DC. They had neighborhood parking there. It made all the sense in the world to me. Here, anyone can park anywhere, and you can park for free. Because our system encourages people to drive. We have a system that encourages encourages people to drive in to park on our streets for free. People will drive around for a half hour, right? And they'll get a free spot. You see it every day. And it's also bad for the environment too.
On the other hand, this revenue of below 60th Street, is that a way to discourage New York City taxpayers from owning cars? So if you yourself own a car in the city, if you have to go below 60th Street to your residence, you would be charged.
Yeah, well, the commission's coming out with the pricing yet. There's a commission that's coming out with this. We don't have it yet, but yeah, it's going to be more expensive to own a car. I assume the garage business is probably a good one to be in around 60th Street. But I assume people will try to park there. But you want to move people off of the car culture is the general sense. I mean, another thing you can do is we have free bridges, right? I mean, you could toll them during rush hour if you wanted to pretty easily. That would raise a lot of revenue. I mean, there are all these sorts of things you can do to raise revenue that would help fund a lot of these changes that I've talked about tonight. Yeah?
Yeah, following up on 14th Street, as you pointed out, it looks empty right now.
Yeah.
It looks inefficient.
Exactly.
So what's the goal?
So again, I think it's a mistake. I think what they've done is only a first step, but I think you have to now reimagine the whole streetscape, because we're thinking about 14th Street as a pathway originally for cars and for buses and trucks, and now it's not for cars. But an empty street is not a good street. It's not a safe street either, as Jane Jacobs would write. So in my mind, what you have to do is actually redesign, re-landscape the entire corridor. And what we've done isn't enough. And I think regrading, I think it could be more narrow. We don't need 2 lanes anymore, right? So you put 1 lane on either side, expanded sidewalk, 2-lane bike lane that's completely protected from the street. There'll be no interaction with the cars. You have more trees, it'll be greener, it'll be safer, it'll be more sustainable. And then you could do that in all the crosswalks, frankly. 34th might be tougher, but 23rd you can do it on too.
Isn't the first step to improve the mass transportation?
Well, you have to, right? So,
I take the trains, and I'm happy enough to use mass transportation, the train, the metro. In fact, now that from 13th Street, I go all the way up to 78th Street, 72nd Street, and if we're standing there,
boom.
take the Q train. I mean, it's good.
Yeah.
But I mean, people, the first problem is a lot of people, well, I don't know how much now, but for a long time, people did not want to take the subway.
Right.
They were either intimidated or felt that it wasn't working well.
So the thing is, the MTA was created in 1968, March 31st, 1968. The reason the MTA was created was to take power away from Robert Moses. So Governor Rockefeller centralized at the state level our rail system and our bus system, and it was Moses' last vestige of power. So the original sin, as I always say, of the MTA is Robert Moses. And it was a power grab by Nelson Rockefeller to remove him from power. The problem was we underfunded mass transit for so many years, and eventually the bill just came due. We just fell behind. There's only so much bond revenue we can raise. We ran out of money. We underfunded it. So it has to work, because if it doesn't work, and it's upsetting that we have the governor fighting with the head of the MTA, and then that leads to him resigning, and he obviously on time. If you've been on the subway over the last year, trains are much more on time now, and they were making good progress. So you hope that continues.
I think that Andy Byford was doing a great job.
I don't know anyone that disagrees with that, by the way. I mean, the governor, you might. But there are proposals where people say, oh, well, maybe we should take over the MTA, which I know sounds great. The problem is the MTA is $40 billion in debt, so 8 million people want to take that on instead of 20 million people in this. I mean, functionally, I wouldn't recommend it because we have enough with our city debt. So there are problems with that proposal too. Yeah.
How would the bike lane, the gradient there, how would that interact with walkers?
So that's where I put the trees that separate them. Otherwise you have the new problem where you have walkers coming into the bike lane.
Right.
So you always need to create, this is where urban architecture and landscape comes in. You always need to have something that separates the two. And there may be certain places where you have to have them we have to have tri-level grading. But usually, like the demarcations we use now, if you think about it, are, I don't know what you call those plastic things, the white barriers. Yeah, I mean, trees would be much better than that. Yeah.
Yeah, all the infrastructure improvements and urban planning improvements seem to be increasing the rents of private landlords, and nobody has ever thought to tax these rental matters. We invest publicly and they collect privately, and you know, density increases the rents as well. I mean, now people stack up 2 and 3 and 4, especially younger people. You know, the rents still go up per location, and no politician has thought of taxing the rents. You think of taxing the out of boroughs commuters, which they have moved away from the city because they have been have been pushed away from the rents, and you punish them with congestion pricing. And you haven't thought of the solution, which is right under your nose: tax rents, and especially luxury rents.
So affordability, you can't have a thriving city that's an unaffordable city. I think we would all agree on that. I think if you look at one of the great proposals that came out recently is what the New York City Controller came out with a very progressive proposal I thought would help with affordable housing a lot. Because part of it is not just taxing, but requiring developers build a certain amount of affordable housing in any development, but also, what I think is interesting, is helping, we have over 1,000 vacant lots here in the city. Or 1,000, just sitting there. Those lots can be developed for 100% affordability, which I think would help a lot. Remember, if the city is thriving, more people want to live here, and so by the natural laws of supply and demand, you're always going to have that challenge, but you have to have dedicated set-asides. When you don't have dedicated set-asides for affordability, it's just San Francisco, which is just literally just it's very, very, very rich, and then everyone else comes to themselves, which we can't have here. Yeah?
Yeah. What is the impact on retail of stopping the cars below 60th?
Yeah, so listen.
See all these empty stores.
So there are 2 issues. So people said, for example, when you close 42nd Street off to cars, it's going to kill the retail on 42nd Street. It's the only part of town that actually has retail that's booming right now. Everywhere else is struggling. Obviously, the Amazon effect is wiping out, store after store. So one of the proposals out there is first, the size of stores have to change. The zoning would allow you to put more smaller stores in because the rents are going to be lower. These bigger stores take up a lot of space and are not going to be making it. The idea is that more people can, as I showed you on the graph, more people can occupy the city, not less, if you remove the car as the top actor. So the idea is you'll have a more thriving streetscape. When you have more people walking around, it's better for the stores. You don't want people driving through and past your store, you want people walking past it. So if you make a more walkable city, I think it actually will be better for retail.
Right now,
Yeah?
I think that a long time ago, if a store was empty because they had raised the rent so high, the landlord was able to take a tax deduction for whatever the modern equivalent of it. Is that still in effect?
No, so there are write-downs that they can take, but one thing that we can do is you can change the tax law that increases the tax on vacancy. So that's one proposal that's going out there right now. So right now there's not a penalty. If you had you have to push people to do things, like incentivization with a carrot and a stick. If you push people, or in this case, a landlord, they're going to be taxed at a higher rate, help negotiate. I mean, the whole retail market, this is an unprecedented time right now. And so there's being a lot of resets that are happening, but if you have to push them over to, to incentivize them to bring the rents down. The vacancy situation is, it's a very big problem, but I do think that stores will do much better in walkable districts. And all the data proves this out, by the way. Walking districts are where stores are doing better right now, and so I think we need more of those. Yeah?
West Village is certainly one of the most walkable areas in the city, and you're losing stores left and right.
Yeah, well, you're losing stores.
On the corner of 8th Street and 6th Avenue, you have a place that Barnes & Noble was there for about 20 years, maybe 30. And now it's been empty for 10 years.
Yeah, it's a long time. Again, those are the big spaces, which I'm telling you are not the future of retail anymore.
It's not that big.
It's pretty
Barnes & Noble
Yeah.
Lincoln Street is.
Right, but believe it or not, the West Village is faring better than other parts of town. That's what's shocking. Yeah,
As to the Barnes and Noble,
Yeah.
it is rented.
it is rented.
TD Bank has been paying for 7 years.
Wow.
They've been paying $200,000 a month. It is not vacant. It's vacant, it's being.
It's vacant, but it's being rented. There you go. I wonder why.
Because they got a couple big leases, and I'm sure they're sorry now, they probably thought they could sublease it.
Wow.
They haven't been able to.
Interesting.
So always what you see is not always what.
That's a great point. I didn't know that about that space. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Commenting on that space, didn't they want to put some kind of bar in it?
A big music venue, which would have been a complete disaster.
Is that?
That's over.
Oh, good.
Thank God.
Yeah, no music and no Robert Moses Museum. All right, well, thanks everyone. I'm your next speaker.